Alô? Bom, boa tarde. Eu vou dar início aqui a mais um evento da nossa série de seminários, a palestra do professor Christopher Thornhill, que é professor está no Departamento de Direito da Faculdade de Manchester e é autor de vários livros, inclusive de direito constitucional, sociologia do direito ligado à história das constituições, direito constitucional. Ele faz esse crossover, para usar, trabalha nesse ponto de contato entre essas disciplinas. A palestra de hoje chama Sociology of Law and the Global Transformation of Democracy. Eu gostaria de agradecer a presença do professor aqui e a presença de vocês. Passo a palavra para eles. Gostaria de dizer que, da maneira como está organizada essa palestra de hoje, depois da apresentação do professor Thornhill, os professores Fernando Fontainha e Marjorie Marona farão alguns comentários, tá? E a gente começa uma conversa, tá? Logo em seguida, inclusive com comentários da plateia, se vocês quiserem. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak here. It's it's loud enough, isn't it?
It's on. Just go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead, speak a bit closer.
You want to hit F5 over there, so like this.
Oh, that's better. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed for coming today. It's fantastic to be here. It's a really magnificent institute, and I'm absolutely delighted to have an opportunity to speak, hopefully just informally, and then perhaps to have discussions of an informal nature also about some of the claims in the presentation. I was asked I'd wanted really to have just an informal conversation about some issues to do with about militarisation, and I'd originally planned a presentation about militarisation and constitutional law, but I was asked to talk more about some recent work that I did on the let me try and get back on the sociology of law and democracy. So what I've tried to do is to fuse, in a way, some of the arguments that I developed in earlier publications on the transformation of democracy and the ways in which this can be explained through the sociology of law, and some of the recent work that I'm developing on the connection between constitutional law and processes of militarisation. Maybe some of the ideas or the basic frameworks that I've developed are perhaps more specific to Europe. So if there are some counterclaims or counter-analyses from a more Brazilian or Latin American perspective, I'd be very interested to hear this and to engage in dialogue with alternative positions. I'm speaking primarily, I know this is an institute with a political science focus. I have to say my own background is in political science. I was even a professor of politics, although it seems a long time ago. But I'm now a professor of constitutional law, or specifically in the sociology of law. But I also hold visiting positions in sociology, so I can work between the three different disciplines in a way. So I am speaking primarily as a constitutional theorist. So this may, I know one always runs up against disciplinary boundaries and disciplinary antagonisms in this way, but although I'm speaking as a constitutional theorist, I'll be perfectly happy to try to change my head and think as a political scientist or as a sociologist as required. I'm going to start off with just some basic points which will be familiar to everybody, and then try to work out an original argument about processes of democratization in different societies, and the connection between processes of democratization, processes of social configuration, and also the conceptual apparatus that underlies or underpins these democratization processes. Now, none of this will be a surprise to anybody. The first principles, the first bits of this will be very familiar. Generally speaking, there are a few principles that underlie constitutional democracy, And so the constitutional democracy can be understood as a system, a type of political system which generates its legitimacy through reference to a series of principles, so that without these principles you don't really have constitutional democracy. And then once these principles are established, constitutional democracy takes shape, and it may take different forms. But I'm identifying the origins of modern constitutional democracy as lying in the revolutionary period at the end of the 18th century. So we've been speaking about Koselleck. In Koselleck's terms, at the end of the Sattelzeit, at the end of the saddle period, which he sees as the 18th century, but I would say the rise of modern constitutionalism we can trace to the period from the American Declaration of Independence to the third constitution of revolutionary France, so 1776 to 1795. The principles are established at this time that become the basis for constitutional democracy. These are a political system is legitimate if it reflects collective self-legislation. Collective self-legislation takes the form of popular or national sovereignty, so it tends to be confined to a particular territorial region, territorially delimited society. So the exercise of national citizenship is at the core of democratic sovereignty. National citizenship particularly entailing the exercise of political rights. That democracy involves collective inclusion in a set of constitutional rights involving guarantees for personal property, for procedural equality, and also for some exercise of electoral rights. And usually democracy begins to take shape at a period in time marked by the eradication of serfdom from society. Now, I'm going to talk about serfdom and slavery. I'm not going to talk about them absolutely interchangeably. Serfdom is obviously a European phenomenon, whereas slavery is more specifically, at least geographically, located in the Americas, and has its origins in Africa. But there are some analogies between. I mean, serfdom did not involve the absolute deprivation of rights that characterised slavery. But it did involve a condition of being owned by somebody else in a way that slavery does. So democracy begins to take shape around a claim to political self-ownership, actually physical and political self-ownership, which are not thinkable in a society in which some form of serfdom or slavery persists. Now, again, this will be familiar. We can divide the development of modern democracy, I think, into a number of different periods. We can talk about revolutionary proto-democracy, the period that I've just described. We can't really find any democracy at this stage, but we can see the emergence of democracy as like the constitutional principles that I just discussed a minute ago. We can see that these begin to take shape at this time. With the exception of the states on the eastern seaboard of the USA, all revolutionary democracies, this will be familiar to all of you, all revolutionary democracies collapsed. And only one constitution from the revolutionary period survived, which was the Norwegian constitution of 1814, and this wasn't really very democratic, but it was the only one that survived for any length of time. Then we're all familiar with the Bonapartist period, in which some elements of democracy were carried over into a more authoritarian system. Then 1815 to 1870, I mean, you could say 1860 or 1865, but I'm saying 1870 for the sake of convenience. You see short-lived democratic experiments, typically based in representative governments with very small franchises. So, I mean, Switzerland and France are outliers from this, in that both Switzerland and France had universal male suffrage from 1848. But at least in the case of France, not really within a democratic system. It was still in a Bonapartistic system. Then we see the period of 1870 to 1914, which is based on partial democracy. This is a characteristic that one can apply to virtually the whole of Europe at this time, which is where you have some basic normative claim to legitimacy, which is based in constitutional democracy, but there are very strong franchise restrictions. So that, for example, in Britain, even after the constitutional reforms of 1867, only about 20% of men could vote. Most countries also had strong franchise restrictions. Where you didn't have strong franchise restrictions, you tended to have executives, very powerful executives that were not steered by or subject to, which were not subject to legislative counterweights. It's only after 1918 then that we begin to see the emergence of mass semi-democracy, which is I take to be a condition of full male enfranchisement. This full male enfranchisement became the norm in Europe after 1918. Some countries also had female enfranchisement, but not very many. The periodization goes on then that all the democracies created after the First World War, with the exception of some Scandinavian democracies and perhaps Britain, as an argument, collapsed in the 1930s. Britain also became authoritarian in the 1930s as well, really. Britain had a kind of semi-representative government from 1931 onwards, so Britain doesn't escape this characterisation. And it's only after 1945, in the period 1945 to 1960 approximately, that you begin to see the establishment of democracy as a stable system. And really at this time it's only in parts of northwest Europe. There were some democratic experiments in other areas, not lastly in Latin America, but they collapsed into authoritarianism very quickly. 1960s through to the 1970s, you can see the generalisation of democracy as a normative expectation. This is in itself counterfactual, of course, because many polities collapsed into authoritarian systems at this time. But distinctive in this is that authoritarianism was increasingly perceived as a deviation from an expected norm. And then from the 1980s onwards, you see the democratization as something like a global phenomenon. I mean, it's obviously there are exceptions to this, and there's been a backlash against this process in recent decades. And what I always say is that when you see the globalization of democracy that began in the 1980s, always created, like all processes of universalization, it also created strong hybrids. So many polities developed on a model which was partially democratic, but also had authoritarian features. But there are even societies or polities that have become ostensibly very authoritarian in recent years, like the Russian Federation. They still have some democratic elements, and this is quite an extreme case, which has now clearly veered towards authoritarianism. But most polities will find elements of democratic representative government and more authoritarian elements. Now, when we look at the history of democracy, I'd like to say, first of all, it becomes clear from this scheme that democracy is a very recent phenomenon. At least as a stable system of political integration. It's very difficult to find democracies before 1945. If we take democracy to mean political inclusion, representative inclusion, without discrimination on grounds of gender, ethnicity or socioeconomic class, there are very few democracies before this time. And that even societies which are usually taken to have reached a stage of full democracy at an early stage in their development always contain some mechanisms or some constitutional principles that means that they fall short of democratization, full democracy. Obviously the USA, it's a commonplace to see the USA as an old democracy, but the USA was really an apartheid democracy until 1964, 1965 because of the political exclusion of minorities in the southern states. Canada had ethnic exclusionary clauses until 1960. Australia had didn't allow it. In Australia, members of Aboriginal communities weren't allowed to vote until 1962. So most polities, even those that seem to have a long democratic tradition, had some characteristics which were clearly discriminatory, so that they can't be classified as democracy. Britain had mechanisms of class exclusion until 1950. So it's impossible using really strict criteria to define Britain as a democracy before 1950. What I want to say, though, but the key point in this is that the period from 1789 through to 1918 was a period of gradual democratisation in which principles that were first floated in the revolutionary period began to take some concrete historical form. But it was only after 1918 that there began to appear experiments in mass democracy, still not full democracy, because in most polities, as I mentioned, there were exclusionary clauses, but or in many polities, women were not allowed to vote. But something like mass democracy began to take shape after 1918. And in virtually every instance, democracy collapsed. It's very difficult to find cases where this didn't occur. Now, what I want to say is that we can understand the collapse of mass democracy in the interwar period as part of a crisis of constitutional vocabulary, or of the terms in which constitutional democracy is actually originally imagined or originally projected. In the vocabulary of constitutional legitimacy that developed at the end of the 18th century itself created a set of contradictions within democratic systems that made experiments in mass democracy unworkable. Really, underlying the presentation, I'm trying to say that the vocabulary that we've inherited in which we try to understand democracy is not adequate to understanding democratisation in complex societies with very strongly divided political franchises. There are a number of reasons for this, and we can touch on these, but it's the last two which are particularly important. In classical notions of democracy, the legitimacy of a democratic system is attached to a very indeterminate notion of the political citizen. So the citizen, which is the source of legitimacy, is kind of extracted from socioeconomic position. But as soon as national political systems began to incorporate their constituencies, they of course incorporated constituencies that were defined by socioeconomic divisions. So the political systems were expected to mediate between class divisions, or to placate tensions of an economic nature between different social groups, and they were not able to do this. I'll come back to this in a minute. Second is that classical theories of democracy tended to concentrate legitimacy around legislatures, and particularly during the 1920s it became clear that legislatures were not strong enough or were not complex enough to mediate the demands of rival groups. So virtually every political system in the 1920s transferred the source of legitimacy from the legislature to the executive, and there are important reasons for this. But what I want to say, and this goes back to a conversation that you and I were having just half an hour ago, one point that I want to say is that when we begin to understand modern constitutional democracy, we need to divest we need to distance ourselves from the basic liberal preconceptions that have come to underlie democratic thinking, in which we assume that constitutional democracy is a kind of political system that's oriented towards consensus and self-legislation and so on, and that citizenship entails a set of practices that are oriented towards collaborative coexistence. In that the origin of modern citizenship is not really it's not located in some kind of orientation towards consensus, as we're told in liberal theory. The origin of modern citizenship, and therefore the origin of modern constitutional law, actually lies in the army. and that the development of constitutional citizenship in the revolutionary period, particularly in France, but to a lesser degree also in what became the USA, is connected to the exercise of military functions. And the reason for this is both complex but quite clear, which is that the nation states or political systems in early modern Europe through the 18th century developed through the expansion of the military apparatus. So that through the 18th century, most European states developed very powerful standing armies, and these standing armies were brought under the control of national governments, of national executives. But by the end of the 18th century, it became clear that most governments couldn't afford standing armies, and the fiscal system of most governments began to collapse under the pressure caused by mercenary recruitment, or the need to preserve large-scale standing armies in which soldiers had to be paid, often not insignificant sums of money. And it was in the period of revolutionary reform through Europe, it was the fiscal crisis of the state caused by the rise of standing armies that led to the collapse of government. And it's in this collapse of government, in the situation created by the collapse of government, that revolution occurred. France is paradigmatic for this, but we can see other examples. I mean, you can apply the same argument to the USA in a slightly different way. What happened then, of course, is that once states had collapsed through revolutionary transformation, the states that emerged in the revolutionary situation were required to mobilize troops, usually because they were attacked by other states. I mean, this is what happened in the case of France. And to do this, states tied citizenship rights, rights to participate in the shaping of legislation, rights to participate in shaping the form of state, to the willingness of citizens to serve in the army. Revolutionary France, again, is a paradigm for this, in that from 1793 onwards, military service was mandatory. So it introduced a system of conscription for all citizens. Citizenship, therefore, constitutional citizenship, in which the citizen stands at the origin of the political system, and in which the citizen provides the basic premise for the legitimacy of state, is not a reflection of some kind of social orientation towards consensus. It's effectively an instrument or a mechanism used by governments to purchase military force. Citizenship and military service were also linked in the USA during the revolutionary period, but not quite as intensely as was the case in France. Citizenship and military service were also linked in Prussia during the period of reform, albeit at a slightly later stage. And through the longer revolutionary period, this became a common phenomenon, that states were reformed. At one level, their foundations were attached to the assumption of rights by an expanding number of people in society, but this was always flanked by the expectation that the people who exercised these rights would provide military service. Very important in this process, of course, is that the revolutionary construction of modern government, almost invariably across Europe, coincided with the abolition of serfdom, with the abolition of personal subjectitude. And the army played a central role in this, that the army usually was a driver behind the abolition of serfdom, not lastly because serfdom prevented effective recruitment. It was more difficult for governments to recruit members of the army in societies where serfdom was entrenched, because serfs were protected by local aristocrats, who of course didn't want them to work in the army because they wanted them to work on the land. So modern democracy, in its origins, is really a form of military democracy, or it's really a form of military constitutionalism, in which is a series of social and economic forces combined to attach the basic construct of constitutional legitimacy, which is the sovereign citizen, to the military exigencies of society. Now, in some ways, this means that from the beginning of modern democracy onwards, democracy always had a dialectical character, and this is very strongly connected to the linkage between constitutional legitimacy and the army. And that, on one hand, the army played a double role in political integration during the rise of democracy, in that the army was instrumental in promoting conditions for democratisation. The processes that underlie democratisation, the construction of a national political system, the construction of a sustainable fiscal system, and the abolition of serfdom, they're all driven, at least in part, by the army. I mean, when standing armies began to develop in the 19th century, regents used standing armies not so much to fight against foreign adversaries, but to colonise their own populations. In the development of military capacity was a mechanism in which states took control of their own societies, quite simply. So the creation of a uniform political apparatus capable of controlling society was partly determined by the army. But then almost invariably, once a revolutionary period finished, once, let's say, the processes we associate with revolution, the transformation of government, the establishment of strong central institutions, and the emancipation of serfs, once these processes had finished, the army usually immediately assumed a different role, in that it moved from being a liberating actor to being part of a system of coercion. And that almost invariably, in the early revolutions in Europe, the emancipation of populations, particularly the emancipation of serfs, did not result in the full integration or the full inclusion of these populations. Rather, these populations became subject to far-reaching mechanisms of social coercion. But what this does mean is at the heart of democracy is we see something like a latent civil war, in that with democracy there arises a system of confrontation in which the military capacities of society are divided. That on one hand, the army, there are elements in the army that support further nationalisation and further democratisation, and there's some aspects in the army that support, whose function is to prevent further democratisation, using military capacity to do so. Now, democracy really developed from the outset as a kind of civil war. It's very difficult to see it in a different way. I mean, revolutionary France, which is the first proto-democracy, was a civil war. It was a constant civil war in which the military apparatus of society was divided, and it was a civil war which created a series of short-lived dictatorships, each of which then collapsed and led to a new period of civil war. This is really just repeating a point that I made before. The primary social process that occurred during the European revolutions was the abolition of serfdom. On one hand, this was driven by the army or by military processes of integration. But at a different level, the aftermath of revolutionary periods was marked by a military retrenchment. What is very noticeable, though, across Europe is that through the processes of social revolution or political revolution that I'm describing, populations that were released from serfdom by revolution often found their way into the army. It was a very important mechanism of social inclusion or social integration in post-revolutionary societies. You can see this in after revolutionary France. Obviously, released serfs were forcibly integrated into the army through the revolutionary conscription and then under Napoleon, but the same applied in Prussia. And the paradigmatic for this is Russia. After the abolition of serfdom in the 1860s, the army became a very common career path for groups that had been removed from their land. At a normative level, so we can see at a functional level or a basic sociological level, modern democracy is very closely connected with militarisation. But we can also see that at a normative level, the modern democracy is closely connected with militarisation. In that democracy revolves very typically, as it began to take shape in crude form through the 19th century, democracy revolved around the reproduction of classical patterns of military interaction in domestic politics. In that, as the crude architecture of democracy began to take shape, the political organisations were closely linked to military institutions. Political parties themselves typically had very close attachments to military organisations. But perhaps most importantly, through the 19th century, the legitimacy of government became increasingly attached to war. This is a fact on which people don't reflect very often, but before 1789, governments declared war on each other, and if they lost a war, then the prince just went home. Obviously, people died, but government continued. Whereas after 1789, when countries declared war and lost wars, the governments collapsed. There are almost no exceptions to this. And the reason for this is that the legitimacy of government in democratizing societies became very strongly connected to military efficacy. And the other key phenomenon that arises from this is that through the 19th century, because the legitimacy of government was so strongly attached to war, domestic politics and processes of interaction in domestic politics became very, very sensitive to international conjunctures. In that increasingly, international conflicts reproduced themselves in national societies, not always in completely predictable ways, but this became an increasingly common phenomenon. We could think of Koselleck here. You know, you were talking about Koselleck earlier. One point that Koselleck makes about when writing about the 18th century is that state institutions became relatively autonomous, and they separated themselves out from patterns of social conflict within domestic societies, and to some degree they also separated themselves from forms of conflict within international society. So Koselleck, like Luhmann after him, would identify a process of differentiation that underlies the rise of the modern state. But this process was undone in the 19th century. In the 19th century, the autonomy of political institutions towards their own societies decreased, and most importantly, the autonomy of political institutions towards patterns of global conflict also decreased. What I'm saying, in a way, is that there's a pathological undercurrent in the whole development of democracy from 1789 onwards, in that there's at the very core of modern democracy is an association of the production of political legitimacy with military mobilisation. And this necessarily connects processes of legitimacy production within national society to forms of social conflict that can't be controlled within that society. Could I possibly just have a bit more water? Is that okay? No, it's okay. Thank you so much. That's very kind. Now, this pathology reached something like an apogee after 1918, where, as I mentioned before, we can see for the first time the development of something like mass democracy for men, at least. And during this period, the connection between militarisation and democratisation created insurmountable obstacles for political systems whose essential purpose was to generate stable conditions for democracy. Most of the constitutions that were created or redrafted after 1918 were to some degree military constitutions, that their essential functions were to pacify militarised populations. You can see this, I mean, this is not always so widely known, but in many countries in Eastern Europe after the First World War, the end of the First World War, mobilised populations just refused to go home. Some of them just refused to give up arms, so that in whole swathes of Eastern Europe, the war really continued for about another 3 or 4 years after 1918. And many political parties developed by integrating what we might call semi-demobilized military units. So they really developed out of military units. So political parties were always close to the army. I mean, in the Weimar Republic in Germany, which was the most important interwar democracy, or experiment in interwar democracy, every political party had a paramilitary wing. This is not only the communists and the fascists, this is the Roman Catholics and the liberals as well. They all had paramilitaries, and they attracted the youth wing by offering opportunities for paramilitaries. Most importantly, though, what you can see in this period, or the next 2 points are the most important points. After 1918, the development of democracy coincided with the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. So that for the first time in modern history, there was like a global political polarity around which different political systems and different political parties oriented themselves. And in many societies, this imprinted a fissure within political structure in which different groups, each of which or all of which had extensive military capacity, opposed each other in terms of their position on a spectrum of opposition to or sympathy with Bolshevism. So that national politics inevitably internalized conflicts that were constructed in the global domain, and in many instances these conflicts were carried out by political parties that had military capacity. One thing, so this, and very few, we can see this in pretty much every European society after the war, after 1918, and very few societies had institutions that could withstand this process of politicization. Of course, in virtually every society, as I mentioned, eventually the executive became the dominant institution, and executives had been reinforced during the First World War, and they were almost invariably very closely linked to the army. Processes of militarization or military coup that we see in different states, therefore, on this explanation, are not really exceptional regimes. They're more products of something like a latent normalcy, a latent contradiction that is always inherent in democracy. Overall, therefore, we can say that before 1945, you really see only two types of democracy. You see either intermittent democracy, where there are short-lived experiments in democracy that are brought to crisis by internal conflicts within particular societies. This would be a characteristic that we could use to describe Germany, France, probably. France lost its democratic structure because it was invaded. Also, women in France couldn't vote until 1946. So France was an intermittent and a partial democracy at the same time. Most societies we would qualify as intermittent democracies, or there were some partial democracies in which, let's say, extreme political volatility was avoided because of the under-inclusion of particular social groups. Now, I would say Britain is an example of this, but I would also say that the USA is an example of this. The under-inclusion of minorities until the mid-1960s, we can find other examples as well. But before 1945, we can't really find any democracies. Just a couple in Scandinavia, New Zealand and Ireland. So I think 4 or 5 democracies before 1945. All of them had a population of under 5 million, which is very indicative. It means that they were typically very socially homogenous, and that there were forms of social cohesion that preceded the development of democracy and made democracy. Now, what I always say when I think about these processes is that the reason for these different processes of democratic crisis, it can't be a coincidence that democracy historically proved so difficult to sustain. It must be something to do with the construction of democracy itself. And we could say that constitutionalism contains certain antinomies that make democracy very difficult to work. It attaches the legitimacy to forms of collective voluntarism, collective mobilisation. It attaches the legal system, the legitimacy of law, to very mobilised forms of citizenship. And probably most importantly, it imagines citizenship as a kind of total integration. collective subjects raise the claim or lay claim to a condition of complete integration within the political system. Now, it's interesting, we tend to think about democracy from the perspective of constitutional law or from the perspective of constitutional theory, but legal sociology or political sociology originally also developed as a commentary on the rise of democracy. This is one argument that I'm always trying to set out, that legal sociology, the sociology of law, was originally a kind of preeminent science of democracy in which theorists sought to provide an account of democratization that was not based on these antinomies that underlie classical democratic thinking or classic political thinking. And the primary, I'll just give a couple of examples of this in a minute, the primary implication in classical legal sociology is that democracy is not caused by the political system. It's not caused by political actors, by collective choices. Rather, it's a condition of social evolution. And it tends to be caused by it tends to be brought into being, sustainable democracy tends to be brought into being by the relative autonomy of the law. So that it's linked to patterns of legal integration within the legal system. You can see a number of examples of this in early sociological thinking or classical sociological thinking, in which I include Hegel, who I always think is a sociologist, really, not a philosopher. But I mean, the philosophy of right, Hegel's philosophy of right, is the first great work in legal sociology, I think. But for whatever differences the classical sociologists had in terms of the construction of the law, there's one argument that runs through all their work, which is that democracy or representative government, in the case of Hegel, he wasn't writing about democracy. It occurs through a process of individual integration, in which processes of social inclusion, the integration of individual actors within the system of government, is linked to the increasing differentiation of the law. You see this most clearly in the legal writings of Durkheim. I mean, Durkheim's argument about this is very telling, in that he says that constitutional democracy develops through the differentiation of law, through the transposition of social interaction onto contractual premises that are defined by legal autonomy or underpinned by legal autonomy. But you find analogues to this in the writings of Weber and Parsons, and of course Luhmann is the classical example of this, who came a bit later. We wouldn't necessarily see him as part of classical sociology. Now, the point that I want to make, in a way, or that I made in this last book, is that the sociologists of law, in setting out this counter-construction of democratization processes, were right. That the political or the voluntarist theory of democracy that we find in classical political theory and classical constitutional law, this described a process of democratization, or it provided the basis for a process of democratization that was also beset by the pathologies that I was talking about before. So that classical models of democracy never actually became real. That democracy on the classical design was never established. And there were good reasons for this. It was only after 1945, as I said at the beginning, that democracy began to become a globally stabilised political form. And the stabilisation of democracy at this time was tied to two very important, or possibly three very important characteristics. The rise of international human rights law, through which there began to emerge something like, for the first time, a global legal system, in which there were certain principles of validity that were relatively independent of national societies. And this led to a displacement of legitimational processes from patterns of subject formation or collective citizenship towards more individualised normative constructs, like human rights. So that national citizenship or national sovereignty lost some of its importance as a source of legitimacy, and citizenship became increasingly disconnected from processes of collectivisation. So I think there was a reorientation in democratic legitimacy after 1945, which is very strongly connected with the increasing differentiation of a legal system, or the differentiation of a legal system at a global level. And this reproduced itself within domestic practices in a number of different ways. And this took place in different times at different parts of the globe. I would say it took place in Europe first, up to about 1960, Northwest Europe up to about 1960, and then in Latin America in the 1980s, and then in Eastern Europe probably through the 1990s. But one important factor that emerged through this process, through the increasing development of a global legal system, is that domestic conflicts became increasingly disconnected from global conflicts, in that domestic conflicts and domestic actors became increasingly inclined to formulate their own political agendas and their own political prerogatives in terms relating to human rights law. And in so doing, they avoided the linkage between domestic conflicts and global conflicts, which had been a characteristic of pre-war, pre-1945 society. I mean, one very important factor, this is more a political science argument, but one very important factor in the stabilisation of democracy in Europe is that parties of the ultra-left, so like the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, and the French Communist Party, they developed political agendas that were based on human rights laws, obviously with an emphatic focus on social rights. But in so doing, they disconnected their own ideological framework from the traditional opposition between Washington and Moscow, so that global conflicts became less likely to penetrate directly into forms of party political controversy in domestic societies. Karina and I have done quite a lot of work on Colombia over the years. Something very similar happened in Colombia during the late 1970s and the early 1980s, in which parties of the left began an ideological reorientation towards recognition of human rights law, at least implicitly in so doing, detaching the basic source of legitimacy from highly antagonistic forms of social conflict. Now, I think that this means that when we try and describe democracy, we try and describe the forms of subject construction or legitimation that we find in democracy, we need to take leave of classical constitutional vocabularies. In that the basic vocabularies of collective agency and national citizenship didn't produce democracy. And ultimately democracy developed around a form which is not anticipated in classical theory. In that the processes of social integration that characterised democracy eventually entailed something like a multipolar nature, in that citizens constructed democratic practices partly in relation to their own institutions, but partly in relation to international norms or international or institutions with responsibility for setting international norms. So to comprehend democracy, we need a sociologically nuanced vocabulary, in that the constant return to ideas of popular sovereignty or national citizenship, national sovereignty, will not tell us how democracy developed, and it won't actually tell us how democracy can be protected. So democracy eventually developed around a pattern that it doesn't really have anything to do with classical constitutional theory. The subjective political imagination that we find in classical constitutional theory, it can't help us to illuminate what democracy actually is. Most importantly, it can't help us illuminate what the threats to democracy are. In that if we begin to understand democracy as a form of multipolar system of interaction, in which individual citizens interact partly with their own institutions, partly with global norm-setting institutions, and in which practices of citizenship, the construction of legitimacy for legislation take place through a very broad range of normative practices that are not really focused upon the exercise of popular sovereignty, we can see that the threats to democracy are rather different from those that might be anticipated in classical theory. And I would say that at the moment, in many societies, we see an erosion of democracy. One reason for this, of course, the sociological reasons for this, but one very deep-lying normative reason for the weakening of democracy in contemporary societies is that we haven't fully understood what democracy is, and that we still try and articulate it or interpret it through a very mismatched classical vocabulary. But usually we can see that democracies come under threat through a series of processes which simplify democracy and which in some ways force people to imagine their political roles or their citizenship roles in terms very similar to those set out in classical theories of democracy. I mean, this is quite widespread across the board, that an insistence on a renationalisation of democracy or the collective mobilisation of citizens is a very, very fundamental feature of most neo-populist systems or semi-democratic systems that are emerging around the globe. Now, on my account, national democracy is not thinkable without global norms. It's very difficult to find any national system of democracy that came into being not on the foundation of international human rights law. Wherever we look, I mean, as I said, there are a few examples of polities but really it was on some foundation created by international human rights law that democracy became a global phenomenon. And in societies now where democracy is becoming strained, the first characteristic that we identify is that the articulation between national citizenship practices and global norms is becoming weaker. And that virtually every, what we might call strained democracy at the moment, is a democracy that appeared to have reached a condition of consolidation, but which is now moving away from democracy, is characterised by a separation of national forms of integration and global forms of integration, whereas typically democracy developed through a very deep connection between national integration and global integration. I can't find any exception to this rule, that the weakening of global norms also weakens national democracy. So political movements are emerging in every country which say, let's take democracy back, take back control, as they said in Brexit, as during the Brexit referendum. Let's take back control. But the claim to take back control almost invariably diminishes collective control, in that it's only through a foundation on global norms that national democracy develops. And the reassertion of collective subjects or collective forms of national citizenship is also a typical characteristic of strained democracies. But the recollectivization of political subjects also usually has an outcome which is diametrically opposed to its ideological claim, in that it usually reduces the role of national citizens in their own political systems. Of course, the other, and this is an argument that Karine has developed over recent months, given that the construction of democracy on global foundations tends to transfer power from legislatures into judiciaries, judiciaries themselves become subject to politicisation. Now, and this is, if we were to start rewriting the history of democracy in 100 years, we might say up until 1945 or up until the 1980s, the pathology of democracy was that it was connected to the army. Whereas we might look back and say that the pathology of democracy as it developed in the late 20th century is that it made judicial institutions very powerful and potentially sensitive to either excessive autonomy or to excessive politicisation. This is definitely a danger, and I think many of you will know a lot more about this than I do. But we didn't develop any democracies without powerful courts. We didn't develop democracies that didn't have a deep interaction between a deep judicial interaction between the national political system and something like a set of global norms. So the question of how to deal with this last point is in a way a constitutional question. But I hope you can see what I'm driving at with this, in that it's an argument which is simultaneously like a political sociological argument, but also a constitutional argument, in that the basic principles that underlie modern democratic systems are founded in constitutional norms that are not real. There's no reality, there's no phenomenological reality to the concepts that exist in constitutional law. And in actual fact, the more we try to realize these concepts, to give them a material reality, the more we destroy the democratic systems that these concepts are supposed to protect. And usually, if we had a description of an object and the description tended to destroy the object, we would change the description. We would think that it was wrong. But we have a description of democracy which is based on these classical principles, which really never, it's not only inadequate as a normative construction or a normative description of democracy, it also tends to erode it. So we do need to rethink these categories. At least, I usually speak about these things to lawyers. I always say there's a particular imperative for constitutional lawyers to assume responsibility for reconfiguring the basic principles of constitutional law. But of course, I think with the exception of Karina, there are no lawyers here. Juliana's a lawyer, aren't you? So it's two lawyers. But thank you very much. I hope that was interesting. And I'd be very grateful if there were commentaries and questions. Thank you.
This invitation, and thanks a lot, Chris, for your lecture and for the opportunity of this delightful reading of this book with the same title as your presentation. So, as a sociologist of law, I was very interested in knowing better your work and hearing from you, and I have two major, let's say, questions for discussion purposes. One, a conceptual one, and a methodological one. So, from a conceptual point of view, I would like to invite you to discuss with us what do you mean by law, and of course, what would be its consequence to draw the spectrum of a sociology of law. And of course, I will advance you much more from what I've read than from what I heard. What I think you treat as a sociology of law. When I say sociology of law, I'm especially referring to a, let's say, a fragment of social organization composed by lawyers and by anyone who doing what they do in everyday life. They call it law. Exactly as Durkheim said about lawyers. So division of labor will gradually produce a part of the population specialized in doing law. But also Faber, when he wrote about the particularization of law in modern societies, he stressed the point that more and more we will have a population absolutely specialized in doing law, and this is beginning to be a language, an assembly of practices almost incomprehensible for lay people, let's say. So, of course, Durkheim considered written law, you know, a very similar to what you consider constitutions as written texts. He considered the written law as a kind of a, let's say, a metaphorical thermometer. So for Durkheim's purposes, French law was, let's say, the best entrance to French morality, as he called himself a moral external fact, the moral external fact by excellency, French law. In your argument, the point you stress, I think, is made under a conception of law that we could hardly distinguish from political activity. You know, so I'm not quite confused, but I think I would identify your book as a constitutional law book with political theory. You know, and I would like to hear you about this consideration. The few points where we can see law and lawyers in action, let's say, the consequence of law. So how lawyers and their professions, their organizations, their corporations, how do they interpret and how do they use in courtroom day life and courtroom everyday life, how they use the Constitution and other legal texts. So I don't know if my point is clear, and you have. I have a clear question here, right? Right. So, and my second consideration, I would love to hear from you about what would you call your methodology, because you have quite strong claims, and of course they make a lot of sense. You know, they surely makes a lot of sense, and I'm really not concerned in agree or not agree with you. I would like just to enlighten some points. You know, I would call your methodology the methodology of the plausibility in depth. You know, you have a strong narrative and it makes a lot of sense, but in many terms you have empirical assumptions. You know, you need to prove your point as the point you're stressing is being built with the text. So you have some empirical illustrations that helps you making this point. I'm not, let me be clear about it, I'm not accusing you of cherry picking, but in...
Worst things have been said.
But I would like to hear from you about your own methodology, and if you think that, let's say, that empirical strategy of yours really helps you making the strong points you make. Once more, being very clear about how delightful and how much and how important is your work. Thanks a lot.
No, thank you very much. I love it when people ask these really difficult questions.
Sorry, Chris.
I love it when people ask these really difficult questions and they're so polite. You know, it makes responding to the questions so much more pleasurable. You know, so thank you very much for your very generous commentary. I think, I mean, both questions are completely valid and contain important criticisms of the book. But I do have an answer in my own mind to both the questions. Obviously, whether you consider the answer robust enough is up to you. I don't do when you say what do you mean by law? I'm not purporting to do like the work on empirical legal facts. This is, and there is a definition of the. Be more inclined to call this socio-legal studies, but there is a definition of the sociology of law or socio-legal studies, which would say that essentially socio-legal studies is the analysis of courts, legal practices, legal professions, and so on, empirical forms of organisation. I mean, for me, this is more the socio-legal studies. I always make a distinction in my mind between socio-legal studies, law and society, and the sociology of law. And I don't know how it works in Brazil, but in Britain and in Europe, people tend to run these concepts together. Certainly, socio-legal studies and the sociology of law are almost invariably seen as effectively the same thing. Now, I would say that the sociology of law is a macro construction of legal functions in society, underpinned by a theoretical construction of society in its entirety. So it's an attempt to, this sounds, it sounds too narcissistic. I'm not saying that I do this, but this is what the sociology of law is. That it's about the location of legal practices, legal interactions within a macro construction of society. Ideally, with some kind of understanding of how law interacts with or facilitates exchanges in other parts of society. So I think to talk about law, we don't need to talk about courts or lawyers, but we can do. Of course, it can be part of the sociology of law. It may well be a very important part of the sociology of law. But when I say what I mean by when I say law, not politics, I mean there is a pretty strict taxonomic separation in my mind here. In the when I say that law is essentially the framing of human interaction in categories which in the final analysis would be subject to legal jurisdiction, not political mediation. So that in some ways, in the absolute final analysis, I mean, Karina and I argue a bit about this sometimes as well. In the absolute final analysis, hypothetically, a legal principle would be subject to the jurisdiction of a court. Now, this distinction is not always very easy to make, of course, because when we think about human rights law, which is a very dominant expression of law at the moment, or in the last 50 years, some rights are created by courts and some are created by legislatures. So this is very difficult to define. But when I say that a principle is law, it's a principle, let's say, analysis of which would take us through a process of regress to a court. Whereas a political principle, a political decision would take us to analysis of a political decision through a similar process of almost infinite regress would take us to a majoritarian decision. Now, I don't think that this split is always absolutely clear and it's difficult to make completely sustainable, but in essence, this is how I would make the distinction. But this, for me, this would be a sociology of law, not socio-legal studies. That it would be, in a way, an attempt to say there is a particular domain of society which is legal. And then you try through a process like through an Occam's razor to try to define what the categorical principles are. Well, when you think sociologically, you don't think about principles, you think in a way about structures of legitimation or structures of authority. So I would say that law, the ultimate arbiter of legal authority is a court, or at least a body to which some form of semi-judicial functions have been devolved. I mean, it's difficult to say in international law. It's always difficult to say in international law, where does the authority come from? So it's perfectly okay if you say my distinction is too slippery. I mean, it will inevitably be slippery. But let's say an international norm, if we try and contest an international norm, in the final analysis, this will take us into a judicial system. It's very unlikely. We're not going to go to the General Assembly of the UN. The contestation over an international norm is always likely to take us into a judicial line of challenge. Now, what would I call my methodology? Thank you very much for engaging with this so enthusiastically. I really appreciate it. You know, I'm always aware that some of the arguments are like counterintuitive, and some of them sort of strike at our inherited democratic imagination. So people sometimes find the arguments oriented towards a weakening of democracy, which is not true. I just try to phrase democracy more realistically. But I would describe the methodology as it's a thick macro-sociological description. So you try to identify a thick macro-sociological description coupled with a critical reconstruction of social norms. I mean, again, in a way, it kind of goes back to Koselleck, that it's almost an attempt to measure social processes against the normative constructions that underpin them. So at one level, there's a kind of intellectual historical attempt to condense or provide a concentrated reconstruction of a set of norms, and then to measure these norms against actual social realities thickly constructed. And so I think that your description is of what I do is perfectly accurate, but I don't have any problem. I don't consider this to be like an offensive challenge or anything. I think that this is actually intuitively correct, but I'm perfectly happy with that. That's what it is. It's just an attempt to provide a thick kind of macro-historical description of social processes, particularly in this case, social processes reflected through the legal system and the political system, and then to measure these processes against the normative constructions that underpin them. And of course, in this case, what I'm saying is there's a mismatch. Is that okay? Thank you very much.
Someone would like to invite Marguerite.
Good afternoon. Well, I think there is no other way to initiate my speech than asking you all, particularly to Professor Thornhill, to be patient with my poor English. I assure you I'll do my best, but it will be probably not enough to perform a good intervention.
Turn the mic up a little bit.
Here we go. Well, I have to thank to Professor João for this invitation, which is a very unique opportunity to me to recover Luhmann's theory from my master classes. And also, it's a very challenging opportunity in the face of the context of the democracy backlash around the world. It's a pleasure to present some thoughts alongside Professor Fernando Fontainha, my research fellow in some sense. And finally, I'd like to thank Professor Thornhill for this lecture, which is very instigating in so many ways. I've already read your book, and which entitled your lecture today, and made some notes, as you can see, some of which I will share with you this afternoon. But there is a range of new comments based on your speech that I'd like to address, if I may. First of all, you claim that through the reconstruction of the citizen, the political system of national society has become part of a global law. This contemporary democracy has evolved as a complex lawmaking system in which legislative acts take place in a number of different cycles of communication around the political system. So, you say, social claims assure legal form through separate process. One of them involve legal mobilization, litigation, and human rights activism. The citizen appears as a legal agent, you claim, even they do not abandon their political form at all. This phenomenon reveals the increasing protagonism of the judicial institutions in several countries, including Brazil. Commonly, political scientists dedicated to the judicial politics agenda associate this protagonism with constitutional design, which in some way explains the fact that not all countries experience the so-called judicialization of politics in the same way or in the same intensity. However, the institutional element seems to be mitigated in the way that your thesis challenges the most usual concepts of constitution and constituent power. I mean in national parameters. What would explain then, and that's the first thing that I'd like to address. The different stages in which societies are in relation to this process of transformation of social claims in legal norms through the judiciary.
Can I try to explain? Can I address that first?
Well, of course.
Is that okay? Sorry, it's just, it's obviously a very contentious question at the moment, so I just, you don't mind, do you, if I take this question first? No? Thank you. It is partly a question of constitutional design, but it's also partly a question of contingency, in that obviously the background to your question, I assume, is that there is a propensity for judicial. There seems to be an increasing potential for judicial arbitrariness or for arbitrary politicization entering a number of judicial systems around the world. Let's say Brazil being a prime example. I think that this both is and is not a problem of constitutional design. I think that in situations where this happens, I touched on this right at the end of the presentation today, saying that this is now emerging as a major threat to democracy, given that judicial agency is becoming such an important form of democratic participation. Some of this it can't be stopped. You can't do anything about it. It's in the nature of the politicisation of the judiciary that the judicial appointments can be subject to control, personal political persuasions, prerogatives can play a role in steering judicial decision making, just as they can in other political branches, just as they can in other branches of government. It's not really any different. In fact, it's very unusual that something like the infection that we see in many democracies now starts in the judiciary. It usually starts in the political branches, but enters the judiciary from the political branch. I would say here, for example, is one example of this. Although individual judicial actors clearly have a high degree of culpability as well. But I'm just thinking about this over the last few days, both as a sociological question and as a question of constitutional design. There is a correlation between polities that have moved away from more classical patterns of democracy in the last few years and the robust institutionalization of global law. If we look at the primary examples of polities that have moved towards a neo-nationalist government which tends to deplete democratic institutions or democratic procedures, these are polities in which, for whatever historical reasons, the purchase of global legal norms, and more importantly, the opportunities for individual citizens to mobilize around global norms, so for the entrenchment of global norms through political practice, is relatively weak. The UK would be one classic example. We have a constitutional doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty which weakens the force of international law. The USA is a classic example where it's debated amongst US American constitutionalists whether international norms can have any authority at all. And Brazil is not like this. Brazil is more of a hybrid. If it's okay, I'm not assuming any expertise, but I do think that this is the question in the background. Brazil is kind of a hybrid in that it's clear that the 1988 Constitution provides high protection for global norms, that there's been increased protection through constitutional amendments. There have been periods where highly positioned judicial actors have actively promoted the incorporation of legal norms. But in other ways, the openings or the articulations between the domestic constitutional system and something like a global normative system in Brazil are weaker than in other Latin American countries. Mobilization around human rights is less strongly protected. So I would say, in a way, it goes back to my argument that if we're going to defend democracy, if we think democracy is good, we've got to know what it is. And we've got to be very clear that this is foundational for democracy, that there's some deep interpenetration. Well, quite simply, however offensive this may seem to people, quite simply, the national societies are not very good at creating democracies. They just don't do it on their own. They do it through some interpenetration between global norms and national citizenship practices. And the higher the entrenchment of this, the better. So that is a question of constitutional design. But why why something like a democratic illness can spread through the judiciary, which undoubtedly does happen. This is very, to define the exact social conjunctures where this takes place is very difficult, because sometimes it takes place because actors in the executive control the judiciary through appointments or personal manipulation, like is happening in Poland at the moment, where the power of the judiciary is being strategically weakened by the government. And sometimes it can happen paradoxically for the opposite reason, which is, and this is Karina's thesis, but I'm in complete agreement with this. Sometimes it can happen almost because the judiciary assumes an excessive degree of autonomy, which maybe provide a better description for what happens in Brazil. So we need a nuanced description of every individual case, but what I would say is that as a general tendency, we notice this type of democratic depletion in systems where, in constitutional systems in which the interaction between national and global norms is not very well protected. This seems to be a common premise. Turkey, Britain, USA, Bolivia, Venezuela, Poland, they would all fit this example. They would all fit they would all satisfy this criterion. So, but that's a question of constitutional design. I mean, if somebody were asking me to set up a constitution now, I would provide extremely robust protections for interaction between national and global norms, but I would also create something like the tutela system they have in Colombia, where international norms can be articulated constantly or activated constantly in everyday practice. Now, there isn't really anything like this in any of the polities that have shifted towards a more neo-nationalist model in recent years. I'm sorry, I'm getting old, you see, so I can't remember so many questions at once. Is that?
No, that's it. I have just
yeah.
one more comment.
Yeah.
May I?
Sure. I just wanted to ask you for clarification on when you say international norms.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that almost everywhere international norms have to be ratified and approved by national legislators, right?
Well,
They're not almost never immediately enforceable.
Well, I mean, many constitutions create an opening for, let's say, particularly when I talk about international norms, I mean, I've got to be very clear that I'm really just talking about international human rights law. I'm not saying that international investment law is beneficial for democracy.
They're historically originated internationally. That's what
yeah. And the international norms, they don't really just enter national societies. I mean, here you'd have to come up with a typology. There are some constitutions which are completely porous to international human rights law. They just say international human rights law has direct effect. There's some that do this. There are some that say, I mean, this model. And then there are some systems in which, obviously systems that are integrated into regional human rights systems, policies that are integrated into regional human rights systems give immediate effect to international law. I mean, regional human rights law is really international law. I mean, it's based on treaties. So because it's based on a set of treaties, it's subject to all the normal restrictions and protections that international law is. And in such cases, courts directly assimilate international law. So it doesn't need to go through legislatures. Courts do it themselves. And in some ways, it goes the other way around. In some ways, courts within national societies will go further than the provisions in international law. So international law is based more on like a cyclical conversation between. So I don't think that I think that this is like the classic monist understanding of international law, but it's in very, very few societies now where every normative principle emanating from international law has to be subject to legislative ratification. Even the US doesn't really do this. I mean, there are plenty of cases in which the Supreme Court, or particularly in the state courts, I mean, this is, when we think about US American jurisprudence, we always look at the Supreme Court, but the state Supreme Courts have gone, in some cases, gone very far in the use of international principles. So, particularly in the more progressive states, like on the Eastern Seaboard, they often quote from the European Court of Human Rights. You know, they'll resolve cases on the basis of the state Supreme Court in Connecticut is an important example of this. So, I think that we need to have a much more pluralistic model of the interaction between national legal systems and something like a global legal system. I mean, even in societies that have an authoritarian disposition, courts will use international law to obtain autonomy for themselves. I mean, it's likely to be a surprise to many people, but the superior courts in Russia are very autonomous. And they use international law, human rights law, very constructively. It's just if there's a big corruption case, they'll leave it alone. But in like 999 cases out of 1,000, they will actually operate very autonomously on standard legal principles. So I do think, I mean, we'd have to come up with a complex typology here, but there are very, very few national legal systems which are into which the only gateway for international norms is through a national legislature. It's almost unheard of now. They're coming through different ways. The US is one of the most closed. I mean, you have to go to China to find, even in China, international norms get into domestic law.
Well, let's continue. And in this sense, citizenship is primarily a figure through which the political system articulates itself with global law, isn't it? And so democratic system is supported by a basic legitimational switch from the citizen to human rights. Also, the communications that assume the form of law increasingly do so because they are articulated with the system of global human rights. In fact, the erosion of the national state assigned to the intensification of globalization presupposed the worldwide recognition of human rights policy. However, one could say that globalization is a process by which given local condition or entity extends itself influence across the world and in doing so develops the ability to designate as a location another social condition. In this sense, globalization is always a process of a successful globalization of particular localism. Consider this.
Can I answer this question?
Yes, that's a question. Should we take for granted the emancipatory potential of language of human rights?
Yeah, thank you very much. You know as well as I do, when you write something, it always seems a bit more definitive than in your own opinion. But I in a way, and I try to say this in the book in different. I mean, I'm not endorsing a completely uniform model of human rights law, and I think that human rights law, it takes different shapes in different societies. But it's very rare to find I mean, Karina and I wrote about this as well, more polemically. But it's very difficult to find, if I understand what you're saying that there are actually, because human rights law is generally attached to a process of global system construction, it can impact very corrosively and destroy the forms of autonomy that it may purport to defend. Yeah. Well, it's very difficult to see this. I mean, in the first instance, I think with the first promotion of global human rights law, this may have been the case. But it's in most instances when we look at the penetration of human rights law into national political systems, where national political systems confront pluralistic legal claims, they become more sensitive when they use human rights law. I mean, the motors of corrosive forms of globalization are usually national executives. Usually comes directly through national executives or through national elites. But the strongest resistance to this, albeit imperfectly, I'm not saying that human rights law would it provides a miraculous remedy for every problem in the globe, but usually the remedy for very corrosive forms of globalization is actually in human rights law. I mean, I think that this is particularly true in Latin America, where minority defense, be it gender minority, religious minority, particularly ethnic minorities, is very strongly connected to human rights law. And human rights law has proved itself very subtle in generating complex protections for communities that are in some way marginal to more uniform patterns of globalization. I mean, all the, let's say, protection for non-typical types of property, protection for non-typical types of identity, protection for non-typical types of or non-classical forms of gender orientation. Most of this comes from international human rights law. It doesn't come from within national societies. It's usually the opposite. So I don't know. First of all, I don't think that globalization and international human rights law are necessarily the same thing. I think the construction of a global legal system, it must have some overlap with globalization, but it's not necessarily the same thing. But the norms that are established outside national societies are typically more sociologically complex than those that are established within national societies, particularly because they interact with national norms. But pretty much anything that we do, which we may consider socially beneficial one way or another, it has its origins in international human rights law. It doesn't have its origins in national constitutional law. National constitutions tend to be, it's national constitutions that are elite driven. And it's national constitutions typically that protect the entrenched power of social elites. It's not the other way around. I mean, the dislodging of social elites, or at least the softening of elite dominance within national societies, usually comes from outside. I mean, if we look at non-typical property regimes, we try and find non-typical property regimes around the world that are in some way construct obstacles to depredatory investment strategies or global trade flows. So the dark side of globalization, I'm sorry, it usually comes from the normative underpinning for regimes of this kind usually comes from outside national societies. It usually comes from international law. And the more corrosive forms of globalization usually take place because of national elites. Because national elites play along with these processes. So I think that it's, to give a twofold answer to your question, it's very easy to overestimate the beneficial power of international human rights law, or human rights law per se. And we can just say it's just law. We can say it creates an ideological mask in which beneath which all kinds of things can happen. But where I'm more reticent is trying to defend local forms of legal organisation or national forms of legal organisation against the global legal system, because I find very little evidence to suggest that national legal systems are more protective than global legal system. Really, very few. I struggle to find any. In that, if we look across Latin America, for example, where you find the strongest defence of legal pluralism, or the strongest defence of minorities, or the strongest defence of, let's say, atypical constructions of property, which like collective ownership of land and so on, which are really, really vital sociological foundations of legal pluralism, these are usually in societies where you have the deepest penetration of international law, international human rights law, not investment law. So I'd say to you, yes, yes. To three implied questions, I would say yes, yes, and then no, not really. I don't think that that human rights law has socially disbeneficial or disadvantageous consequences.
Just one. Well, in some sense, I think that I'm trying to say that, and you say that in your book, if litigation in relation to human rights replace political participation as a foundation for lawmaking, aren't we reinforcing some patterns of excluded citizenship? You know, what I'm trying to say is that, well, that human rights are a kind of a part.
Okay, no, I get this completely. Okay, I understand. Okay. I mean, I do say... Sorry. I do say at one point, I do say something like this at one point. So, yes, absolutely, but I don't really say that there's a simple binary switch. I do think there's a legitimational switch in which, let's say, legal principles become more important than classical political principles, but that's not the same as saying that people just stop political participation. I don't say this at any point. But what I do think is that, and here again we need to think so hard about the sociological facts. It's increasingly difficult for pure political participation, that is mobilisation through parties, mobilisation through electoral practices. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's increasingly rare for practices of this kind actually to expand the fabric of citizenship rights that people occupy and exercise. That the expansion of rights, because political participation is almost inevitably caught in majoritarian cycles, and majoritarian cycles have a national disposition against the expansion of new rights. I mean, up to beyond a certain threshold, you could say that with the creation of mass democracies in Europe after 1945. And in Latin America through the 1980s, then the mass political participation created a system of rights beyond which mass democracy is unlikely to extend. I mean, how is it possible for there are some rights for which majorities will not mobilise, or are very unlikely to mobilise, particularly under certain social and economic conditions. And the expansion of the fabric of rights that exists in society, so the expansion of the scope and the reach of citizenship, is likely to come out from outside. And this coming from outside, as I say in the book, that itself might take place through processes of collective mobilisation. But it's also likely to take place through legal interaction. And that it's really through legal interaction that the contours of citizenship now are expanded. I mean, there is an outer limit to this, the system of rights for which citizens on a majoritarian basis will mobilise. I mean, let's say reproductive rights in most Latin American countries were never established through election. They were never established through election. They were established through litigation. And I would say that the capacity of a woman to dispose over her body and its contents, for example, is a fundamental aspect of citizenship. But it didn't come through legislation; it came through litigation. And there are innumerable examples. Virtually all the minority rights that we see have not developed through political mobilisation, because there's almost like a logic of diminishing returns in collective mobilisation through politics, that once you get to a certain level of social rights, the majoritarian political systems are likely to show increasing indifference towards minority rights, minorities of different types. So I think this now needs to be seen as a fundamental constituent of citizenship. I certainly don't say it's the only form of citizenship, but I don't see how we can understand citizenship outside this. I mean, I call it a multi-articulated system in which citizens interact with their own political system through two channels, through classical forms of political representation and through forms of legal mobilisation. And I would say that it's legal mobilisation that typically touches the outer limits of the content of citizenship, creates new rights, expands the fabric of rights, whereas political mobilisation tends to consolidate and reconsolidate, or not, or to destroy existing systems of rights. So this assumption that collective political mobilisation on a majoritarian basis brings with it social emancipation is only true up to a point. It's not really very true at all. Obviously, to simply abandon classical forms of political representation would be ridiculous, but it's not. These forms of political mobilisation are hardly decisive for the configuration of citizenship. I mean, it's a kind of universal phenomenon that when there are strong attacks on the rights of select minorities, be it religious, ethnic, whatever, political majorities will not mobilise to defend them. They don't really do it. The minorities may mobilise for themselves, but that will never be reflected into positive legislation. So the two cycles of political communication, one through litigation and one through standard forms of political mobilisation, have become like parallel components of citizenship. And this is to do with, I mean, obviously you could litigate for rights in many political systems, but it's with the rise of international human rights law and the creation of very strong presumptions in favour of select rights or minority rights that litigations become so important. It's unfortunate we can't look to majorities in our own societies to defend democracy. We can see evidence of this here, we can see evidence of this in Britain. You can never rely on majorities in your own society.
Okay,
Yeah, sure.
let's open the floor for questions. Do you want to?
Oops.
Watch it.
It's all right?
Oh, God.
That's okay.
It's okay?
The paper was so bad he decided to kill me.
You want to grab the mic?
Could I just have some water?
Go ahead. Sure thing. They're recording. Oh, okay. You don't need to use